Hello. The Line Unbroken is taking another step into the Tales from the Cards custom first stage content, moving on to the second adventure pack of the Doom Mastered cycle, Among the Outlaws. So let's once again begin with the hero.
Okay. Boar the Faithful has a threat cost of 6, 2 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense, and 3 hit points. The Easterling trait, and his text reads, Action, discard 1 corruption from Boar the Faithful to ready him. He gets +2 attack and +1 willpower until the end of the round. Limit once per round.
So, before one of the great battles against Morgoth, there were two tribes of Easterlings who allied with the elves, specifically with the Sons of Feanor. Bor allied with Medros, Ulfang allied with one of the others. I don't remember.
I think it's Curufin or Caranthi. It's one of the ones that begins with C.
Right. And Ulfang betrayed them at that battle, but Bor remained faithful, hence the name. So, my general thoughts on this, well, I have a bunch. The first is that this was only the second repeatable means of removing corruption in the game at this point. The first, obviously, being Fingon from the core first stage set. So that's obviously quite powerful, and you can do it every round, and rather than having to exhaust a hero in the case of Fingon, you actually ready Bor and give him better stats.
One of the comparisons I always make, actually, is obviously Glorfindel, specifically the Spirit Incarnation, obviously, which I forgot to mention. Bor is a Spirit hero. But yeah, obviously he's 1 more point of threat than Spirit Glorfindel and 2 less hit points. But the rough equivalent of Light of Valinor is like half built in to begin with, so you can end up with a 3 willpower, 3 attack hero.
Except you need a way of getting that corruption on him. This is odd. I think during playtesting he actually had 4 hit points. I'd forgotten that he only had 3 on release. Another comparison that I tend to make is to the Sylvan Tracker in the official content. The Sylvan Tracker, obviously, because it removes damage from all Sylvan characters when they're ready during the refresh phase, it makes them very good sinks for archery damage. And in the same way, Bor can be a very good sink for corruption, because you can just take it away gradually over time.
So actually the other thing, coming back a bit to the Glorfindel comparison, is yes, you need a source of corruption for him, but you don't need to actually trigger his ability until you know you're going to need him in combat.
Yeah, or if you just really need the 1 extra point.
Exactly, yes.
There's also, though, if you have a consistent means of corruption, then there's no particular reason not to do that. During playtesting, people they brought up the concern that it might be too powerful with a repeatable source of corruption, namely Maeglin from the Mastery Sphere, since, of course, Maeglin, anytime you explore the active location, you add a resource, and if you place a corruption, then you can add 2 resources instead. So you could just do that every round, but then Maeglin is a 3-cost ally to effectively be the equivalent of Light of Valinor for Bor, except he also generates resources, but it's not so terrible. I feel like if there's an overpowered element in that combo, it's Maeglin rather than Bor. And personally, I found that in some ways it can be just more impactful, the fact that corruption from the encounter deck you can just ignore a lot of the time because you just put it on Bor and then in a couple of rounds it's gone. In particular, there is a card from Trial Upon the Marches, what's it called? Renewed Grief, I think. It's a condition which attaches to a hero, and then each round it forces you to either reduce their stats or put a corruption on them, and Bor just turns that into a benefit rather than a downside. Beyond that, of course, you can use other player cards. I mentioned Maeglin. Dark Elf, of course, is one of the best ones. Darkheart of the Smith would be good, except I don't think there are any unique weapons that you could attach to Bor, and there is an event at the end of this pack which can optionally place corruption, which could also apply. Finally, of course, the Harp of Fingon can trigger based on Bor, because it just triggers based on a corruption token being removed from play, which obviously happens when you discard it from Bor.
So I think we move on.
Yeah. Before moving on to the first ally, I'm just going to mention what Ian said when we started playtesting, which was that his intentions with some of these player cards were to give more non-unique allies that could be useful, to continue developing the Garwaith trait with the ransom keyword, and also to give a couple of things that might help out with using Beren as a hero. So just bear those a little bit in mind as we go, and you can definitely see the reasoning for some of those cards based on those intentions. So our first ally is the Brethil Hound. It is a 3-cost spirit ally with 1 willpower, 2 attack, 1 defense, 2 hit points, the Hound and House of Haleth traits, and it reads a response. After Brethil Hound participates in an attack that destroys an enemy, choose a player. That player reduces his threat by 1, limit once per phase.
The first note I'd make, of course, is it is kind of an expensive combat ally, because, 3 resources is more on the expensive end. But on the other hand, it's a spirit combat ally, so in general, obviously that's rare in the first age. Non-unique spirit combat ally, definitely rare.
My first note is just that it's 3 resources for 2 attack, but in spirit that's more reasonable than in tactics that would seem just way too expensive, obviously. You'd expect 2 for 2, but in spirit it's alright. Then, of course, the ability, though, is the real appeal here. It's helpful that it's flexible, you can apply it to a player other than yourself, but even leaving that aside, just the power of being able to drop your threat by 1 every round has clearly been shown in the main game with Hero Galadriel and Spirit Beregond, and the fact that it means your threat basically never goes up. In this case, of course, the Brethil Hound is non-unique, so you could get 3 of them into play and drop your threat by 3 every round, which cancels out the basic threat increase during the refresh phase and drops you by another 2.
The one thing I'd say is obviously you ideally do want a reason to be doing it, because its engagement costs can obviously be an issue, but it's one thing I've found is that sense of, I can put in a bunch of good threat reduction here, but actually if I don't need to have a low threat, then it doesn't necessarily matter.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, you may consider using this ally in the first stage anyway, just because it's a non-unique combat ally, which you may need, but it's better to have an idea of you specifically want to be below engagement costs, or you want to be in secrecy. The other comparison as another 3-cost spirit card would be the Galadhrim's Greeting, which is not on the approved list, but regardless, you still make that comparison. The Greeting obviously can drop your threat by 6, whereas the Brethil Hound drops your threat by 1 each round, so if it kills 6 enemies over 6 rounds, then it gets you the same threat reduction. That probably won't happen, but on the other hand, you're getting that 2 attack every round, so it definitely seems like very good value based on that comparison.
Of course, one small final note is that it's technically limited only once per phase, so
if you have a means of readying the Brethil Hound and having it attack in a phase other than the combat phase.
Yeah. In practice,
that's unlikely.
It'd be rare, but technically possible. Yeah. Next ally is Algund, who is a 0-cost unique mastery ally with 2 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense, 3 hit points, the Garwaith trait, ransom 3, and response. When the discard pile is shuffled back into the encounter deck, deal X corruption to Algund to choose X cards in the discard pile. These cards are not shuffled back into the encounter deck.
So, my first point is, of course, he has Ransom 3, and I feel like he's not particularly worrying if you don't pay the ransom and just have him as an enemy with only 1 attack, and it takes 4 attack to kill him, which maybe that could be a problem. Sometimes you might only have 3, and you want to get him on your side as quickly as possible, although maybe you don't. Maybe you do because of his willpower, but maybe you don't because you're just looking for his ability, which is fine to wait a bit for, because it only applies when the deck reshuffles. Obviously, the value of the ability, it sort of depends on the quest, and it sort of depends on player count, because the number of players you have will affect how many times you're likely to cycle through the encounter deck. So, arguably, he's better with more players because you'll get through the deck more times, although in some ways it's debatable because obviously his ability, you put corruption on him, so unless you then get rid of that corruption in the meantime, or get rid of him and play a new copy, he'll have that corruption already, so when you have to reshuffle the deck a second time, you can't do it again. So there might be a sweet spot where, potentially, if you're only going to get through the encounter deck once and reshuffle it once, then you choose to use Algun's ability to not reshuffle 2 or 3 cards, and then you never see those cards again for the rest of the game, guaranteed. Whereas with 4 players, then it might be, okay, so you don't reshuffle those cards one time, but then a few rounds later you reshuffle the deck again and then they come back.
So certainly that fits with my experience with different player counts.
Actually, one point which I had never considered before, but which could be applicable, is it doesn't have to be when you've actually run out of the encounter deck. So potentially, if you want to use this guy even in solo, it could be applicable if there are effects on encounter or quest cards which say shuffle the encounter discard pile back into the encounter deck and probably discard cards until such and such. Because if you've already gotten past something annoying, you would then not have to reshuffle it. And that would definitely apply in a solo context, that you're probably not going to get through the entire encounter deck, so you are probably never going to see that card again. One interesting point here is the amount of corruption you can put on him, and therefore the amount of cards you can choose not to reshuffle. Obviously you could do 2, I believe you could do 3. I think I may have brought this up in the original Mastery review, in the context that an ability triggered by placing a corruption, you still should get to complete the ability even if placing that corruption corrupts the character. Specifically because I asked a rules question for the main game about Cold from Angmar and effects like Quick Beam or Hero Treebeard, and the answer was that if you trigger their abilities to place the damage, you do get to finish resolving the ability before their text boxes become blank. And so I would assume that this would apply in the same way, so you could, on reshuffling the encounter deck, place 3 corruption on Algund, and therefore you would be able to have 3 cards not shuffled back into the deck, but then Algund immediately becomes corrupted. On the other hand, you might very deliberately do that on the grounds that, well, he's not that worrying as an enemy. As I said, he only has 1 attack, he's not that difficult to kill. And then possibly you just have another copy of him that you can play next round.
Because it might mean you end up essentially fighting him 2 rounds in a row if you don't pay the ransom cost.
But he's not that worrying as an enemy.
And equally, at higher player counts, that could mean essentially using his ability multiple times over the course of a game, which we will mention that as a potential downside. So there is a way around it.
Yeah, and it's definitely potentially pretty powerful. The obvious comparison is Out of the Wild. Of course, that definitely removes a card for the rest of the game because it puts it in the victory display. But on the other hand, the advantage of Algund is that if you've gone through the entire encounter deck and are about to reshuffle, then you have the entire encounter deck to choose from for which card you want to not see again. Whereas Out of the Wild, you just have to hope that there's something in the top 5 that you really want to get rid of.
And that's even if we're only 1 card, and obviously, as I said, with Algund, it's 2 or 3, so...
So, our next ally is the Fostered Son. The Fostered Son is a 1-cost leadership ally with 1 willpower, 0 attack, 0 defense, 1 hit point, the Edine and Noble traits, and action. Discard Fostered Son to reduce the cost of the next unique Edine ally you play this phase by 2.
Well, the first obvious point is that, obviously, the cost reduction looks good. The one thing that you kind of have to realise is, unless you had a sort of tricksy way of getting the Fostered Son into play, this is effectively only a cost reduction of 1. Yeah. But, potentially, that's still worth it, obviously. Well, the note is that, of course, you can obviously play the Fostered Son, just use him for that 1 point of willpower until you need to bring in the probably more powerful, unique ally.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's not like this is just a cost reduction of 1 for an ally. It's an ally with 1 willpower, so you can quest for 1 for a while. You can put a point of corruption on him, so that you don't have to put it elsewhere. And then you discard him to get that cost reduction later on. It's a problem that you can often run into when you have some powerful but more expensive allies, that you have to debate, well, do I play a cheaper ally that will be more useful right now, or do I save up for the more expensive ally who will be more useful in the long run, and this allows you to do both, because you play the cheaper ally who is useful immediately, and that effectively automatically saves up for the more useful unique ally that you can play in a subsequent round, and you can play them cheaper as well.
There can also be other considerations. There's obviously no sphere restriction on which
So
unique
if you
ally
have lots of leadership resources but not enough resources in another sphere where you want to play a unique ally, then you pay one leadership resource to effectively get two of another sphere to play that ally.
With Finrod in play as well, he suddenly becomes, for the time being, one resource for 2 points of willpower, which is obviously an absolute bargain.
Yeah, and he doesn't have any sort of downside like the Sylvan Refugee or Finduilas, who are your other options for one resource for 2 willpower. One simple point to note is the unique Edine. It says unique Edine character, but as far as I know, there's never going to be a way that you could play a hero, reducing their cost or not. So unique Edine allies, there are 5 at present: Huor, Hador, Barahir, Morwen, and Tuor, all of whom are pretty useful, and their costs range from 3 to 4, so the cost reduction is obviously welcome in each case. Hador could be an interesting one, since he also has an ability which discards him to bring in more allies. So you could discard Hador to bring in allies, including fostered sons, and then discard the fostered sons to bring in Hador again, and just keep going like that. Especially if you can reshuffle your discard pile into your deck.
I think one of the last little detail, of course, is if you have some means of exhausting the fostered son during the resource or planning phase, then you could, of course, use that before triggering the action. It's just, it is only valuable in the planning phase, but I think Very Good Tales on the approved list. I imagine
Very Good Tales is fine. Of course, he only costs 1, so you won't get as much out of it.
Not a great pick, but it's a possibility, at least.
Yeah.
Next ally is the Elder of the Realm, who is a 3-cost lore ally with 2 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense, 2 hit points, the Teleri trait, and response. After a treachery card is revealed, discard a card from your hand, spend 1 lore resource to discard the top card of your deck instead. If the first letter of the treachery card's title matches that of the discarded card, cancel the when revealed effects of the revealed card. Limit once per game.
So the way I tend to look at this ally is you're effectively paying 2 resources for 2 willpower, which obviously is a good deal, and 1 resource for cancelling a treachery at some point in the game.
Given that cancellation is hugely powerful, that's potentially worth it. And again, there's the whole thing where 2 resources do not usually get you 2 willpower outside of Spirit.
No.
So
it's an interesting one. I look at it sort of like Water in the Water, trying to get through the doors of Durin, where you can either deliberately build around it and specifically include cards in your deck which have matching first letters to the treacheries that you could potentially cancel with this for a specific quest, or you just put in whatever cards, but then you're probably still going to have some matches. I suppose it's more difficult to have matches here than in the case of Water in the Water, because there it's any encounter card, whereas here it's only treacheries. But if you just have a decent range of starting letters, then there's a possibility.
One of the things that I know we both tend to feel about this is not necessarily feeling convinced by spending a lore resource to use the top card of your deck rather than something in your hand.
No, I mean, it could work, I suppose, if you have a means of scrying the top of your deck, but generally you don't. So it's just a random stab in the dark if you really want to cancel this treachery but you don't have the right card. But realistically, you'd rather just have a lot of card draw to get cards in your hand, and then potentially you might even deliberately not play certain cards, even though they'd be useful, because you want to cancel a certain treachery.
Of course, this is the kind of card where it really helps if you know the encounter deck.
Yeah.
It's an interesting way of going about it, but again, cancellation is such a powerful effect. So,
of course, worth noting, it's limit once per game, but that is supposed to be limit once per game per copy of Elder of the Realm. The one other point to mention is that this clearly has synergy with other effects which rely on discarding cards, or having cards in the discard pile. I don't actually remember if the First Age Approved list has been updated since Treachery of Rudar, which of course was the adventure pack right before this was released. But if it has been, or even if it hasn't, it probably should be updated to include Elven Light, for example, or indeed Lords of the Eldar, both of which clearly you want to get them into your discard pile, and this is one more way of doing that.
Failing that, there's the other thing is I'd assume that you could use Silver Harp to simply immediately pull the card back, which kind of gets around one of the problems of having to discard a really useful card.
Our final ally of the pack is Wolfman. Wolfman is a 0-cost mastery ally with 0 willpower, 3 attack, 1 defense, 2 hit points, the Gaowaith trait, ransom 4, and action. Exhaust Wolfman to immediately declare him as an attacker and resolve his attack against an engaged enemy with 1 hit point remaining.
The first thing, of course, is that is obviously a very high ransom value, the equivalent of a 4-cost ally, but the flip side of that is you are getting 3 attack, which in an
3
ally
attack and
is,
an ability which specifically uses that attack.
Yeah, which in an ally, that is pretty good.
As I recall,
anyway.
originally during playtesting, the ransom value was lower. I think it was only 2, and I gave the bit of feedback just on immediately looking at the card that's too good for only 2. Especially since, remember, with ransom keyword, the resources could come from any sphere, so it's effectively neutral.
Yeah.
So 2, definitely too good. 4, more debatable. But that's clearly a useful ability to have.
Equally, though, again, the fact that ransom is effectively neutral is relevant. And to some extent, obviously, with 3 attack, you actually have a bit more of an incentive to actually spend the resources.
It's a bit more worrying than the 2-attack Outlaw Scout or the 1-attack Algund if you don't pay the ransom and therefore have them as an enemy. As far as the utility of the ability goes, I just make the simple comparisons to Quick Strike Quick Strike, it's obvious, the comparison, so that you can kill an enemy before they attack you again. Or, of course, to Gondorian Spearman, where the Gondorian Spearman you can use to kill an enemy that has 1 hit point remaining. This you can do exactly the same, so long as they have 2 defense or less, which is the downside. They have to have low enough defense for you to actually do damage.
Yeah.
That's the Wolfman.
So our first attachment then is Nathan, which is a 1-cost unique mastery attachment, has the name trait, and reads, attached to Turin Turambar, limit 1 name in play. Resources on Nathan can be discarded to satisfy the ransom keyword. Response, when an enemy with the ransom keyword is defeated, add 2 resources to Nathan.
Just as a side note, it probably will never come up, but it slightly bothers me that all the names are limit 1 name in play rather than limit 1 name per character. It's obviously blocking off the possibility that another character could have multiple names in future. I don't know if that'll ever be relevant, though.
Well, Turin, as a character, is the one with the large number of names.
So Nathan, in the story, is in fact the name that Turin is using at the time of the events depicted in this adventure pack in the quest, when he is among the outlaws, the Gaowaith, working with them. And Nathan means simply the wronged, because this is when he has sort of been exiled from Doriath. He's sort of chosen to exile himself rather than actually see if he's going to be exiled. But either way, he feels that he's been wronged, and so he names himself the wronged. So this obviously ties in very much to the ransom keyword, and therefore the quality of it, how useful it is, depends on the development of that keyword. At the time of its release, we have 3 ransom allies, the Outlaw Scout, Algund, and the Wolfman. And Algund, of course, is unique, so you can't have more than 1 of him in play at a time. And I personally feel like that's not enough for this to really be useful. But with more ransom allies, it definitely should become useful.
I'd say, particularly, of course, given that to get some of these resources, you have to actually essentially fight at least 1 ransom ally.
Yeah, I've tended to find... I've tried to use this, and I've tended to find that it's a bit superfluous in practice. Partly because by not paying the ransom, you are effectively getting allies for free, which means you're saving up resources normally, even leaving this attachment aside, so you have more spare resources resources to pay ransom costs without needing this. So it becomes less necessary. But as I say, if we get more ransom allies, then this will become more useful. The other aspect that one has to consider also, though, is the limit one name in play, which means if you play Nathan, you cannot play Mormagil. Or maybe it might be a case that you could play Mormagil to replace Nathan, I'm not sure. I don't know if this would be like restricted where you can play a new one and discard an old one, or if it would be like uniqueness where if there's one in play you can't play a new one.
On the other hand, you're pretty much going to be planning on just which one name you're going to use anyway. And yes, personally I know I would usually pick Mormagil over this.
Yeah. As I say, I feel like this will get better with more ransom allies being released, because it'll have more to do and you can build a more dedicated ransom deck, but at the moment, Mormagil seems better. So next is the Forge of Belagost. The Forge of Belagost is a one-cost unique lore attachment with the item and forge traits. It reads, attached to a dwarf character. Action. Exhaust Forge of Belagost and attached character to heal X damage on a character. X is the number of item attachments on that character.
The first thing I know I'd like to bring up is the Petty Dwarf Survivor, because of course the Petty Dwarf Survivor is a zero-cost dwarf ally, so that gives you a very cheap dwarf to potentially attach the Forge to.
Yep, but even without that, there are plenty of options. You have things like the... Oh, what's it called?
Dwarf of the Blue Mountains?
Yes, it is just Dwarf of the Blue Mountains. Telkar the Smith. There are some on the approved list, Veteran Axe Hands, Sigil Miners, and so on. So there are plenty of options for who to put the Forge of Belagost on, though whether you'd include them if you weren't specifically planning on using it is another question. I find it weird that a Forge heals, but obviously the connection to item attachments sort of makes sense thematically. You can compare this to Secrets of Craft, which draws cards for a player depending on the number of items that you control. But in some ways I find this potentially easier, because the issue is that there aren't that many item attachments in the lore sphere. Whereas in this case, it's the item attachments on the character you're healing, so they could obviously be from a different sphere which has items in it.
Yeah, and one obvious point is that some of the characters who are like to need the most healing are usually going to be, say, tactics defenders.
Yeah. Who may well have items like armor and weapons.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was thinking, honestly, it might be worth it just for Fingolfin with his shield alone.
Of course,
the debate... Keep your defender alive.
Of course, the debate then is the shield is giving him +2 defense, so he's defending for 6. How much damage is he actually going to take? Of course, it could depend on shadow effects. There could be shadow effects that just deal damage directly. And of course, if there is direct damage which you can assign as you like, obviously you can deliberately assign that damage to characters who have items on them, knowing that you can heal them with the Forge.
An interesting point there, of course, is that since the Forge itself is actually an item, if your relevant dwarf has more than 1 hit point, then that just gets
The Dwarf of the Blue Mountains actually would be a good case for this, because the Dwarf of the Blue Mountains has 2 hit points to start with, and then gets more for the number of unique attachments you control, which would include the Forge. So you put the Forge on the Dwarf of the Blue Mountains, he's immediately up to 3 hit points and can heal himself. Obviously, this is limited for healing, but there's a fairly limited amount of healing in the first stage as it is, so more is definitely useful.
Think it's one of the reasons why I would say it might be worth it just for Fingolfin, because there's so little that you can use that having something as a fallback when your super defender does take damage, however rare that is. Moving on. Our next attachment is Angrist. It's a one-cost unique leadership attachment with the item and weapon traits, and reads, attached to a hero with the House of Bayor trait. Restricted. Attached hero gets +1 attack. Action. Exhaust Angrist and the attached hero to choose a face-down enemy. Turn that enemy face up and deal 4 damage to it.
So, first note is, this is a very limited card in its applications, because it says attached to a hero with the House of Bayor trait. That is only Baron at present. He's the only one. And, of course, the ability allows you to turn a face-down enemy face up, and the only means that we have of turning enemies face down is Luthien. So this is specifically designed for a Baron and Luthien deck. Although, even without Luthien, you could just use it for the +1 attack on Baron.
Yeah, so it obviously makes it very thematic, having essentially a very specific Baron and Luthien card.
As I recall, Baron actually took Angrist from one of Feanor's sons after beating them up because they were trying to kidnap Luthien.
Yep, that's right.
So it wasn't originally his, so one could argue the theme of it only attaching to him, but it's certainly nice to have something
given that what he then did with it afterwards was cut the Silmaril from Morgoth's crown.
Yeah. So, as I said, you could play it just for the attack boost, in which case you can compare it to the Dunedain Mark or the Sword of Numenor in the official content. But assuming that you're playing it in a Baron and Luthien deck, you can use the ability, which it's an interesting one. Obviously, it is powerful to deal 4 damage. On the other hand, the reason that you would use Luthien's ability on an enemy is to have them out of play for a while so that you don't have to deal with them, and this turns them face up again to deal the damage, at which point you have to potentially deal with them again.
Because some of it can be a timing thing, though, because either you turn the enemy face down in the quest phase so you don't need to get past their threat, but after quest resolution you can turn them face up again before the end of the phase and deal the damage. And obviously they're going to come back anyway, so you may as well get that advantage. Or you could actually turn them face down in the combat phase before they attack, and then turn them face up again after you've resolved enemy attacks.
Yeah, so that you can still attack them as well as dealing with damage. Yeah. Of course, if they have 4 hit points or less, then they just die.
Yeah.
But if they don't, and there are a lot of fairly high hit point enemies in the first stage, then this could be a useful place to have access to direct damage effects to do that extra damage. Or say Ecthelion, if you're dealing with an enemy that has high defense, this obviously deals 4 direct damage, and then Ecthelion ignores defense when he attacks, so anything with 8 hit points or less you can kill with this combo of Angrist and Ecthelion. Or of course the Wolfman, who we looked at earlier. For a lower defense enemy that has 5 hit points, this would be an easy way to just kill them.
Yeah.
So that is the attachments. Our first event is Song of Parting. It is a 1-cost leadership event with the Song trait and reads Response. After an encounter card with at least 3 threat is revealed from the encounter deck, choose and ready a character. That character gets +2 willpower, +2 attack, and +2 defense until the end of the round.
The first obvious point is this is also designed for Baron, though it's not restricted to him.
No, but it is a perfect Baron card. Obviously, he himself would certainly benefit from readying, especially with stat boosts, and it has the same trigger that he does after an encounter card with at least 3 threat is revealed from the encounter deck. So anytime you reveal a 3-threat card, Baron will gain a resource, which you could then use to play Song of Parting, even if you had no resources on him beforehand. So anytime that you are using Baron, you can play Song of Parting.
It's hard to think of some other comparisons, because there are a few other, often songs again actually, that give temporary stat boosts. Maybe not often. I'm mainly thinking of Durin's Song here.
There's Durin's Song and Halfling Determination.
Yeah. Alright, so not always songs, but...
And obviously those are also good. They give all the stat boosts. This is not restricted to a specific trait, and it also provides readying, which means you are guaranteed to be able to use 2 of those stats, presumably willpower and one of the others, because presumably you're questing when you reveal the card with at least 3 threat. So this is clearly a step up, except it has that specific trigger, rather than Durin's Song or Halfling Determination being just generic actions that you can play in any action window.
Yeah. I think a couple of key points is actually the fact that it is until the end of the round. I'm pretty sure, I know certainly Halfling Determination is just until the end of the phase. Obviously it would pretty much need to be until the end of the round because the trigger is what it is, otherwise the attack and defense boosts will not make any difference. The other thing is, again, some of it can come down to knowing the encounter deck, but there's usually a decent number of 3-threat cards in, I'd say, most of the first stage quests, or higher, obviously. And one of the other things is, obviously, the cards that will definitely not trigger it are treacheries, but one relevant excellent point there is that a treachery isn't adding threat to the staging area.
Yeah.
It's doing something else nasty to you.
So
But...
this gives you the extra willpower, potentially exactly when you need to have that extra willpower.
And equally, maybe a bit of extra combat power may also be relevant if what the 3-threat card is an enemy. Then having more combat power available both through the readying and the stat boost.
Yeah. One other point to note is that if you have multiple copies of this and multiple leadership resources, you could play more than one of this in response to the same card reveal. Obviously, you might then have to ready more than one character, though I don't think you have to, because it's phrased similarly to San Gamgee, where the two effects are not contingent on each other. Or maybe they are. You have to choose and ready a character. So if you can't ready a character, you can't do it. But you could give multiple characters readying and stat boosts. So potentially this could be something that you just save up until you're going to have one big round where everything is going to go to hell and you need everyone firing on all cylinders.
Our final card then is None Shall Break, which is a 2-cost mastery event that reads: Action. Ready each character with an oath attached. Lower the cost of None Shall Break by 2 if each character that readies takes 1 corruption.
So this is the other card I mentioned that can work with Bore the Faithful, obviously, because you have that option of putting corruption on. Although it might be superfluous given that Bore can already ready by discarding corruption, and this is another way of readying him. But whatever. The oaths, of course, there are 4 of them from the core First Age set. The Oaths of Friendship, Vengeance, Silence, and Feanor. And it's certainly interesting. I definitely like the idea that cards like this can give more potential value to a theoretical deck focused on oaths and give more value to the oaths that you might otherwise be less keen on. This is similar to stuff that's happened in the official content with songs. Well, songs with the spoiled event Burst into Song and Fireside Song and Love of Tales, and mounts with Hero Elfhelm have a similar effect. So likewise, this event and the core First Age event hold to the oath, which gives stat boosts to characters with oaths attached, give more value to the oaths, including ones which you might not be as keen on playing otherwise.
One thing I tend to think with that is that, the flip side is that it can feel like this is a card that's more worth using if you feel the oaths are worthwhile in the first place.
Yeah, personally, I think I would like it more if possibly we had more oaths, partly because some of them I don't like as much, and don't tend to use as much. So the other point I want to look at is the optional corruption, because sometimes it can be useful to take corruption, but it's interesting to note that, of course, it's all or nothing. You can't put corruption on some of the characters you're readying and not others.
Yeah, which really, among other things, makes it very dependent on the willpower of those characters. Yeah. And indeed if they have any corruption already.
Yeah. I mean, actually, one could potentially consider this in a deck, say with Bore, and only one oath intended to go on Bore, because then it's just a free means of readying him and giving him another point of corruption that he can use to ready again in another round.
The one potential downside there, of course, is that readying Bore without triggering his own ability, his actual stats aren't up to much. On the other hand, of course, you could use None Shall Break to ready him for combat, declare him as an attacker, and then
ready him with his own ability,
exactly,
putting him up to 3 attack, and then he can attack a second time.
Exactly.
And then, I mean, maybe... No, I was thinking maybe hold to the oath to get more stat boosts, but then that one is less valuable if you're only boosting one character, quite clearly. But, I mean, equally, I suppose, if you have means of removing corruption, if you have Fingon, say, instead of it being Bore, then you could do that on any hero with just one oath. Beyond that, obviously, the corruption is risky in the case of the Oath of Feanor, because the Oath of Feanor's function is, well, part of it is that you can't remove corruption from them, and the other part is the ability to swap their attack and willpower. But if you're putting corruption on them, then that may become a bit risky to swap their stats around.
Yes, well, one of the more interesting choices for the Oath of Feanor is actually Caranthir.
Yeah, so you can swap his 2 attack to 2 willpower.
Exactly. But you cannot deal any corruption to him ever because he has printed 0 willpower.
Yeah. On the other hand, of course, if you're using Galvorn armor, then that is another way that placing corruption on a character could be valuable, specifically. And also, the attachment from Trial Upon the March is hardened, specifically requires the attached hero to have corruption equal to their willpower, in which case you want to get that corruption there as fast as possible to make use of hardened. So if you're trying to use that card, this could be useful, though you'd probably want to have other sources of corruption as well. It's just nice to have multiple options. So, that is all the player cards from Among the Outlaws. Some definitely seem more useful than others, some more difficult to use, but it's a nice set of cards. Thank you for watching, and I will move on to actually playing the quest next. Goodbye.
Okay, goodbye.